All right, everyone, this is the video to watch in December or early January to get you ready to enter the spring semester where you will be writing your pilot study and your Qual 2. The goal is to end up with 3 serviceable research questions and a methods paragraph that you're going to email to me. This segment of the video, there's going to be 2 segments. This segment goes over how to brainstorm those research questions. Okay, so I want to briefly first talk about the 2 assignments. Okay, so to have a look at these assignments, and you have these assignments already, so this will give you a chance to really look through them and take some time over January to do that. So your qualifying exam 2 is essentially a draft of your research dissertation proposal. So occasionally we might refer to it as your dissertation proposal, just so you know, it really has exactly the same parts. Just like everything we do in this program leads up to the dissertation and builds on each other. So this is your draft of the dissertation proposal. And the first paragraphs kind of go over, you know, when this happens, why it happens, etc. Where you really want to look is right here where it's broken down, all right? So you see here that you've got headings. These things right here that are underlined are your overarching headings. They're going to be centered and in bold. And then these other things that are in bold are going to be your subheadings, and they're going to be left justified bold. All right. So one thing is just it helps you right off the bat to know what your headings and your subheadings are. Now you're going to have subheadings and so forth that are your own work, but this gives you a sense of the broad organization. All right. Some of this should look really familiar, right? You've got a paragraph or 2 that's, hey, this is what's going to happen in this paper. You've got your problem of practice statement, which you've worked on before. Your background of the problem of practice, you should have some draft of. Now, what's probably new is the research purpose and significance, and we will go over how to write this in class. And of course, as you read the dissertation that you are going to be reading before our start of class in January, pay special attention to the research purpose and significance. And then finally, of course, we're going to be coming up with research questions, and these will be revised over time. So don't panic about the ones you're coming up with right now. In section 2, again, this should be familiar. Your review of the literature is going to be centered. Usually people have 2 sections, the review of the review of the empirical literature, and then your theoretical framework, all right? So you give like a paragraph or your overview what we're going to do, and then the subheadings within the lit review are your own. So those are going to be kind of your areas of the literature. And then the theoretical framework will be probably centered heading, and you might have drafted a theoretical framework already. If not, you should be probably reading and really thinking about what theories you want to use in your work. And then this will be a new section, right, which is your methods. So this will be centered. And then you'll have your research design, your setting, participants, instruments, strengths and limitations, and positionality. And we will work on all of those sections during class this year. If you want to get a head start on any of this, you can look at the videos that are already under my YouTube channel. And then the Qual 2 just has a conclusion where you write a paragraph just summing it all up. Now, turning to the pilot study, scrolling to the top here, it should look very familiar, right? Your section 1, introduction, problem of practice, research purpose and significance, research questions. So notice it is exactly the same. So as we work on this section in your pilot study class, it's the same as working on it. We're going to be working on it together across the 2 courses. The review of empirical and conceptual literature, same sort of thing. You've got your lit review, your theoretical framework. Those are going to be the same for the pilot study and for the Qual 2. And your research design is also going to be the same, with one exception that as you finish up your pilot study, you're going to revise some of your research design. So it's in past tense, and you're going to be adding this bit in purple, which is how you analyze your data, which does not need to be in the Qual 2. So basically everything in purple from here on is not in the Qual 2, and we're going to be writing pieces of these towards the end of the pilot study course. So you can see here, we've got your findings. So you're going to be analyzing your data. You're going to be writing up one theme in your findings. You don't have to write up everything. And then you're going to be writing up a discussion. Now, just a quick heads up that you will be collecting 2 pieces of data for your pilot study around, or at least. Now, if you're doing a survey, you're going to have to survey 10 people or 8 or 10 people, something like that. If you're doing interviews, it's 2 interviews. If you're doing different kinds of methods, maybe observations and interviews, I would suggest 1 observation, 1 interview, because a pilot study is for trying out your data collection and your data analysis. All right. So that's a quick kind of overview of the assignments. I wanted to do this in the video so that you had time to look through it and to ponder it over the break. Okay, so back to research questions. So there's many different kinds of ways of writing research questions, but one way that I find works pretty well to generate some draft research questions is to make sure you have 4 areas, all right? One is a specific context. Now, you probably don't want to actually name the school, but like a kind of school, for example. So an alternative education setting among university diversity courses in a public institution, in high schools, or among 9th grade classes, right? Does that make sense? So like something fairly specific in terms of the context. Then you want to be specific about who is the focus, right? Is it bilingual teachers? Is it 3rd through 5th grade elementary science teachers? Is it African-American youth, right? So who is the focus of your study? And then of course, what are you hoping to find out? So what are the main constructs and main ideas? You also may need mechanisms, processes, or relationships. So as you brainstorm research questions, think about, is there a mechanism I'm interested in? Is there a process I'm interested in? Is there a relationship that I'm interested in? And as you go through these slides, please pause. Every time a research question pops into your head, pause and write it down. So by the end of this slide set, I want you to have a good number of research questions, like 10, that you are, brainstorming and like trying different ways to configure them, and then we'll narrow them down. So here's an example. So there's different ways to start research questions as well. In this case, I started with how can, and the specific context is a Hispanic serving institution, which CSU East Bay is, and then who is the focus is Latino students. And what I'm hoping to find out is whether more intensive outreach programs increase sense of belonging among Latino students. So I'm interested in them having an increased sense of belonging, and the mechanism is intensive outreach programs. So when you put it all together, it says, how can a Hispanic serving institution increase sense of belonging among Latino students through more intensive outreach programs, right? You can see how this research question is specific and targeted, and the way it's worded implies an action research question, because the words how can, generally speaking, imply action research. That means I'm going to try to do something, which is the intensive outreach program, and then I'm going to research what happens. So here's another potential question phrasing. Starting this question with, in what ways? How can or how does, in what ways? Those are, I really like in what ways. I think that's a really nice question phrasing for qualitative research. In this case, the specific context is an alternative education setting, and the focus is science teachers. And what we're hoping to find out is how they incorporate project-based learning into their work with marginalized students. So there's kind of another focus. There's two groups of people who are the focus, science teachers and marginalized students, all right? So in this case, the question reads, in an alternative education setting, in what ways are science teachers incorporating project-based learning into their work with marginalized students? And this wording implies a case study because it starts with at an alternative education setting. And that says, here is a bounded case. All right. So if it said across 3 high schools. In what ways are science teachers incorporating project-based learning? That would be a multiple case study. If it said, just in what ways do science teachers incorporate project-based learning, that's not really implying a case study, right? Because there's no specific bounded setting. So maybe it's an interview study or just a mixed method study. So I'm going to give you in the next few slides, and again, keep brainstorming questions here. I'm going to give you some examples from quantitative and qualitative research, and these are specific studies that are published. In red is the question phrasing, in green is the predictor, and in blue is the outcome. And there's a few other things in there. And I'm going to talk a little bit about wording for quantitative studies. So this first one says, what is the relationship between teacher empowerment and the capacity for organizational learning? So what is the relationship between is often a quantitative question. Although it can be answered qualitatively, it usually implies a regression analysis. And the two constructs are teacher empowerment and capacity for organizational learning. And in this case, they don't specify an outcome versus a predictor. And this is probably a survey. The next one says, what are the relative impacts of leadership practices, school organizational conditions, and teacher learning on teacher practices? So very clearly, this one has four predictors. And the outcome is teaching practices. And this is implying that it's going to be a regression kind of research, quantitative research. And notice it uses the word impacts. The word impacts is a quantitative word for research questions. Definitely do not use the word impacts if you're doing qualitative research. The next one says, do students who do not read at grade level have opportunities to use instructional materials? Do other group members prevent them from manipulating these materials? This is an evaluation research question, right? And maybe they might be a little more specific about the context, but you can imagine that first question, do students have opportunities? Now, one thing I do not like about this research question is it's a yes or no question. I would word it, to what extent do students have opportunities? And that opens it up a little bit more, but it's still quantitative. And finally, a question that says, what are the effects of gender and socioeconomic status on student persistence in the math science pipeline? The word effects is also quantitative. So if you are doing a qualitative research, I do not recommend that you use the word effects. And notice also that there are two predictors, gender and socioeconomic status, and there is an outcome, student persistence. Now here's some question phrasing for qualitative research questions. Now notice, I'm just going to start with the first part of each question. The first question says, how is? The second question says, how can? The third is, how does? The fourth is, what is the role of? And the fifth is, in what ways do? All right, so play around with these different starters of questions. Now, in green on this one is the area of interest or mechanism, and in blue is the methods or context, all right? So for the Harris question, how is teacher pedagogical change fostered through organizational development across 3 school improvement projects? You can see that the context is 3 school improvement projects. So now we know it's a comparative case study, and that they're looking at teacher pedagogical change and how that's fostered through organizational development. That's the mechanism. That's what they're interested in, and that's the mechanism. The second question says, how can the teacher ensure that all group members are active participants and that their opinions matter to other students? So this to me implies action research or maybe a self-study. Especially a teacher might do this kind of study, right? So the area of interest is that all group members are active, right? And their opinions matter. And the mechanism is the teacher. The teacher is doing this process. And we're trying to understand the processes by which teachers do that. Watanabe asks, how does accountability testing influence instruction? in language arts, okay? So very clear, right? Like, now notice she doesn't use the word impact, she uses the word influence. That's a more qualitative word. That's a very good qualitative word. She's interested in instruction in language arts and how the mechanism is how accountability influences it. And then notice there's a context, 2 focal teacher classrooms, right? Which we know is a case study or a multiple case study. Coburn and Wolfen ask, what is the role of reading coaches? So they're interested in what reading coaches are doing in mediating the relationship between policy and teachers' classroom practice. So mediating is a mechanism, right? Mediating the relationship between policy and teachers' classroom practice. In this case, relationship is not used quantitatively, it's used qualitatively. And then finally, one of my research questions, in what ways do science teachers perceive and react to centralized reform? This is a terrible research question, by the way. It's changed since I made this slide. Versus flexible context-based science education reform. It is very specific. We know it's about science teachers. We know it's about their perceptions and reactions. And this was an interview study. Okay, so again, just emphasizing some starters, and I'm hoping you're really filling a page with research questions here. Really, if you haven't, pause and brainstorm some research questions. What are you interested in? Again, quant question starters can be, what is the relationship? What's the relative impact? What are the effects of? To what extent? Qual question starters are, in what ways do? How is, or how can, or how does? What is the role of? And other good qualitative words are fostered, facilitated, mediated, perceived. These aren't starter words. These are words you might use in the question. We saw influence. What is not so good is when, who, or do. These questions tend to be answered by simple facts or yes or no questions. So be aware of that as you brainstorm. Okay, so again, a reminder that impact, effect, and relationship tend to be quant, fostered, facilitated, mediated, role, perceive, tend to be qualitative. You may end up with 2 questions, especially if you're doing mixed methods. Okay, so I'm going to talk in this slide a little bit about how question phrasing indicates particular kinds of research. So these all have to do with how outreach programs increase a sense of belonging among Latino students. And the first question, if you ask, how can a Hispanic serving institution increase a sense of belonging among Latino students through their intensive outreach programs, that implies action research, because you're asking, how can we do it, right? And the second question that says, to what extent does these intensive outreach programs increase a sense of belonging among Latino students? This implies quantitative or evaluative, right? Like you've got this outreach program and you want to know to what extent it increases a sense of belonging, right? That is, it could be an evaluation. If we start with the word which outreach programs increase a sense of belonging among Latino students at a Hispanic serving institution? That is probably quantitative. Now we're actually comparing 2 different programs or more. It could be quantitative, it could be evaluative. It could be mixed methods, of course. Now think about if we started the question with, in what ways? In what ways do intensive outreach programs increase a sense of belonging among Latino students? Think about what kind of study that would indicate. So you might have thought interview, you might have thought like a case study, right? You might be gathering different kinds of materials to answer that question. So that maybe implies a little bit more of a qualitative. Okay, so now you've kind of gotten a sense of the overall idea of research questions. Really think about all of these potential ways of writing research questions. And I want you to iterate based on those different potential ways of understanding something till you have 10 to 20 questions. And in the next video segment you'll watch, I want you to start crossing out questions and really land on 2 or 3 that are feasible, that are specific, and that will meet your needs.